In the year 1519, a group of Spanish soldiers climbed a high mountain pass and looked down into a valley. What they saw stopped them cold. A vast white city, rising out of the middle of a lake, linked to the shore by long stone causeways, shining with temples and towers. It held more people than almost any city back home in Europe. Some of the soldiers wondered if they were dreaming. That city was Tenochtitlan. It had been founded less than 200 years earlier, and within 2 years, these same men would help destroy it. To understand how astonishing it was, you have to go back to its beginning, because the people who built it started with nothing. The Mexica, the people we often call the Aztecs, were not always powerful. They arrived in the Valley of Mexico as latecomers, poor wanderers, looked down on by the established cities around the lake. They were pushed from place to place, unwanted, until they ended up on a swampy, snake-filled island in the middle of Lake Texcoco that no one else wanted. According to their own story, that was exactly where they were meant to be. Their god had told them to settle where they saw an eagle perched on a cactus, eating a serpent. On that miserable island, the legend says, they saw the sign. So around the year 1325, on a patch of mud in the middle of a lake, a despised people began to build. That eagle on the cactus is on the Mexican flag to this day. Now think about the problem they faced. They had chosen to build a city in the middle of a lake. There was barely any solid ground. There was little fresh water to drink, since the lake was partly salty. There was no room to farm. By every measure, it was one of the worst places imaginable to build a great city, and they turned it into one of the greatest cities on the planet. They did it with breathtaking engineering. To make land, they drove wooden posts into the lake bed and packed in earth and stone, expanding the island outward year after year. To feed themselves, they built chinampas, rectangular garden plots staked out in the shallow water and filled with rich mud from the lake bottom. These floating gardens, anchored by the roots of willow trees, produced enormous amounts of food, several harvests a year. The people grew a city's worth of crops on the surface of the water itself. To cross the lake, they built great causeways, raised stone roads that ran for miles from the island to the mainland, wide enough for many people to walk side by side. The causeways had gaps spanned by wooden bridges, which could be pulled up for defense. To bring in clean water, they built an aqueduct of stone and clay that carried fresh water from springs at Chapultepec, on the shore, all the way into the heart of the city. And to hold back floods and keep the salty water at bay, they built long dikes across the lake. The result was a city laced with canals. People moved through Tenochtitlan as much by canoe as on foot, paddling along watery streets between the buildings. The Spanish, when they saw it, compared it to Venice, the great canal city of Italy. But Tenochtitlan was far larger than Venice, and far larger than almost anything the Spanish had ever seen. If a buried indigenous wonder is the kind of story you came here for, take a moment now and subscribe to Obsidian. This channel is about the greatness the conquest built over and tried to make us forget, and there is so much more of it. And stay close, because the size of the city is the part that truly stuns. Let us be careful and honest about the numbers, because honesty is the rule here. By 1519, the population of Tenochtitlan is estimated at around 200,000 people, and by some counts considerably more, perhaps up to twice that. Either way, it ranked among the largest cities in the entire world at that moment. Now compare it to Europe. It was far larger than Rome at the time, far larger than Paris, by many estimates around 5 times the size of London. In all of Europe, only a couple of cities, like Constantinople, may have rivaled it. So was it truly bigger than every single city in Europe? That is a close and honest call. And the most careful answer is that it was bigger than almost all of them, and matched or beaten only by perhaps 1 or 2. But step back from the contest, and the real point is undeniable. A city built by indigenous Americans on a lake by hand stood shoulder to shoulder with the greatest cities on Earth and towered over nearly all of Europe. That alone should be famous everywhere. The Spanish who saw it could barely believe it. One of the soldiers, Bernal Diaz, wrote years later that the sight was like an enchanted vision, that some of the men asked whether it was even real. Cortés himself compared the city to Seville and Cordoba, the grand cities of Spain, and admitted that in some ways it surpassed them. These were hardened conquerors, and the indigenous city left them grasping for words. And it was not just big. It was clean and ordered in a way that shamed the cities of Europe. The streets were swept daily. There were public latrines, and waste was collected by canoe and carried off to fertilize the chinampas. While the great cities of Europe were choking on their own filth, Tenochtitlan ran on a careful system of sanitation. 1,000 workers, it is said, kept the streets clean. The contrast with the muddy, reeking capitals back across the ocean could not have been sharper. At the city's edge lay its greatest marvel of daily life, the market of Tlatelolco. Cortez wrote that as many as 60,000 people came to buy and sell there every single day. You could find anything: gold, silver, jade, and feathers, cacao beans used as money, food of every kind, cloth, pottery, medicine, tools, and slaves. The Spanish, who had seen the markets of Europe, said they had never witnessed anything so large, so orderly, or so well stocked. It was a center of trade for an entire empire. At the heart of the city rose the sacred precinct, dominated by the Templo Mayor, a great double pyramid topped with twin shrines. From its summit, priests could look out over the whole shining city and the lake beyond. Around it stood palaces, temples, schools, and the homes of a vast and ranked society, from the emperor down to the common farmer of the floating gardens. This was a capital in every sense, the beating heart of an empire that stretched across much of what is now Mexico. So how does a city like this fall? The answer is brutal and fast. When Cortez and his men arrived in 1519, they were welcomed into the city at first, but the welcome turned to bloodshed. The Spanish seized the emperor, fighting broke out, and the Aztecs drove the invaders out in a desperate battle. It looked for a moment as if the city had saved itself. But two forces doomed Tenochtitlan. The first was alliance. Cortez was not fighting alone. He gathered tens of thousands of indigenous allies, peoples like the Tlaxcalans who hated the Aztecs and their demands for tribute and sacrifice. The fall of Tenochtitlan was, in large part, a war of indigenous peoples against the Aztec Empire, with the Spanish at the center. The second force was disease. Smallpox, brought from across the ocean, swept through the city, killing huge numbers of people who had never encountered it, including leaders in the middle of the crisis. In 1521, Cortez laid siege to the island. He cut the causeways, destroyed the aqueduct, and built ships to control the lake. Slowly, street by street, canal by canal, the great city was starved and battered into ruin. When it finally fell, much of it had been torn down in the fighting. And then the Spanish did what conquerors do. They built their own capital directly on top of the ruins. They called it Mexico City. That is the haunting end of the story, and also the reason it is not really an end. Mexico City, one of the largest cities in the world today, sits directly on top of Tenochtitlan. The Spanish drained the lake over the centuries and built across the old lake bed. For a long time, the Aztec capital seemed lost beneath the modern streets. Then, in 1978, workers digging near the cathedral in the center of Mexico City struck the buried base of the Templo Mayor. The Great Pyramid was still down there, under the heart of the modern capital. Today you can walk among its excavated ruins, in the middle of the city that was built to erase it. Return for a moment to those floating gardens, because they were a quiet miracle. The chinampas were not rafts that drifted. They were long, narrow plots of rich black mud, staked out in the shallow lake and anchored by the roots of willow trees planted along their edges. Fed by the nutrients of the lake and watered from below, they were astonishingly fertile, producing crop after crop all year round. A city of 200,000 people was fed, in large part, by gardens grown on the surface of the water. The water that gave the city life could also destroy it, and the Mexica engineered against that too. The lake was prone to flooding, and parts of it were salty, unfit to drink or to farm. So they built a massive dike across the lake, miles long, to wall off a freshwater zone around the city from the brackish water beyond. It was a feat of hydraulic engineering on a scale few societies anywhere had attempted, all built by hand, without iron tools or draft animals. The city ran on order. Tenochtitlan was divided into districts, each with its own temples, markets, and officials. Canals and streets were laid out in a deliberate plan. Canoes carried goods and people along the watery avenues, while the great causeways handled the foot traffic to the mainland. For a city of its size, in any part of the world, this level of planning was remarkable. It was also a city that educated its children. Among the Mexica, school was not just for the elite. Boys, and in their own way girls, were sent to be taught, learning history, religion, song, proper conduct, and the skills of war or craft. A society that sends nearly all of its children to school is rare in the ancient world, and it tells you how organized and ambitious this civilization was. The emperor's own household amazed the Spanish as much as the city did. Moctezuma kept vast gardens filled with plants gathered from across the empire, an early kind of botanical garden. He kept a great collection of animals, an aviary of brilliant birds and an array of beasts, tended by hundreds of keepers. The conquerors, who came from the grandest courts of Europe, had never seen a ruler keep anything like it. Picture the famous meeting. When Cortez finally entered the city, he was met on one of the great causeways by the Emperor Moctezuma himself. Carried in splendor, the lake shining on either side, the white city ahead. Two worlds, which had never known the other existed, stood face to face on a stone road built across a lake. Few moments in history carry that much weight, and the cleanliness genuinely stunned the visitors. Human waste was not dumped in the streets, but collected and carried off by canoe to fertilize the chinampas. Public latrines stood along the causeways. Crews of sweepers kept the streets spotless. A Spaniard who had walked the foul, muddy lanes of European cities found himself in a metropolis cleaner than anything back home, and said so. It is worth dwelling on the comparison the Spanish themselves made. They did not describe a primitive village. They reached for the names of their own greatest cities, Seville, Cordoba, Venice, and admitted that Tenochtitlan rivaled or surpassed them. These were not flatterers. They were invaders, with every reason to belittle what they found. And still, the city left them awestruck and grasping for words. Hold all of that together, and the achievement comes into focus. A people who started as unwanted wanderers, given the worst land in the valley, built one of the largest, cleanest, best organized cities on the planet in the middle of a lake in under 200 years, with no iron, no working wheels, and no draft animals. They did it with engineering, planning, and sheer collective will. By any fair measure, it belongs on the short list of the greatest cities the world had ever built. That is why the loss still stings, and why the survival still matters. The Spanish did not just defeat an army. They dismantled a wonder of the world and built their own city on its bones, draining the lake that had made it possible. For centuries, the lake was gone, and the Aztec capital seemed erased, paved over by the growing modern city. But a city that great does not vanish completely. Its plan still shapes the streets of modern Mexico City. Its ruins still lie beneath the pavement, and its founding image, the eagle on the cactus, flies on the flag of an entire nation. Tenochtitlan was conquered, but it was never truly erased. It became the foundation, quite literally, of the country that rose after it. There is one more thing worth saying about scale. We tend to imagine that the truly great cities of that era were all in the Old World, in Europe and Asia. Tenochtitlan shatters that assumption. At the very moment Europe was sailing out to conquer the world, the largest and most sophisticated city those conquerors would meet on all their travels was not in Europe at all. It was here, on a lake, in the Americas, built by the people the conquest would spend centuries trying to erase from the story. So the next time you picture the great cities of 500 years ago, do not picture only Europe. Picture a white city rising from a lake, laced with canals and floating gardens, fed by aqueducts, swept clean every day, holding 200,000 souls, bigger than almost any city on the continent that conquered it. The people who built it began as despised wanderers on a snake-filled island, and they raised one of the wonders of the world. They could drain the lake. They could tear down the temples and build a cathedral over the rubble, but they could not erase what the Mexica achieved. The proof is still there under Mexico City, in the buried base of the Templo Mayor, and overhead, on the national flag, in the eagle on the cactus. Tenochtitlan was here, and it was greater than the empire that buried it. If you want to keep uncovering the Americas they tried to make us forget, Obsidian is just getting started. I will see you in the next one.